Brent Swanser, Mysterious Universe, writes, the time Alexander the Great's army was buzzed by UFOs. There were plenty of times that Alexander the Great had ET UFO contact. One time when he entered the Taklamakan desert of Mongolia, when he crossed the Himalayas, he lost 10,000 of his 30,000 manned army. And supposedly he did meet with UFOs, extraterrestrial aliens, Atlanteans, whatever, that gave him the lightning rod of Zeus, which he used to use in his conquests. But he also had help from a mothership with a fleet of UFOs conquering the island of Tyre. They used laser beams to bring down the walls of Tyre so that Alexander the Great could conquer Tyre. So you can see that these entities and these UFOs had an impact on human history. Now, what about these UFOs with Alexander the Great's army? There are a few figures from history as well known as Alexander III of Macedonia, commonly known as Alexander the Great, who became the king of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedonia 336 BC at the age of 20. Throughout the course of his rule, he would forge one of the largest empires in history, stretching from Greece to northwestern India, in addition to carving out a reputation as an undefeated military leader and might, and one of history's greatest and most successful military commanders, as well as gaining the status of being one of the most influential figures on Western civilization. There have been many tales of Alexander the Great's numerous exploits and conquests, to the point that he has become an almost legendary, larger-than-life figure, and one of the strangest of these is the time his army was supposedly harassed by UFOs. A very early report of a bizarre battlefield encounter with something very unusual in the sky supposedly happened in 239 BC during one of Alexander the Great's many military campaigns. At the time, the army was advancing on an enemy city, and there was an enormous procession of elephants, horses, and men ready for war. According to the account, as they attempted a nighttime river crossing at the Jakartas River in Central Asia, now known as the Sir Darya, the army was dive-bombed by and menaced by two great silver shields spitting fire around the rims. That was so frightened them and panicked the animals that they postponed the crossing until the next day. The account originally came from Macedonian historian Alexander Donsky, who passed it along to the famed UFO researcher and author Frank Edwards, who wrote of it in his book Stranger Than Science, but there has been some skepticism as to its veracity because there is no other known source for that story. Edwards would write of the account this: Alexander the Great tells of two strange craft that dived repeatedly at his army until the war elephants, the men, and the horses all panicked and refused to cross the river where the incident occurred. What did things look like? His historian described them as great shiny silver shields spitting fire around the rims, things that came from the skies and returned to the skies, he said. Did any of this really happen? There has been a lot of discussion and debate on the account, and while it has been held up by some in the UFO community as a genuine account of ancient UFOs, there has of course been a lot of skepticism aimed at it as well. Historian Spencer McDaniel has written this of it: Edwards does not cite any sources of any of these claims, and it's unlikely that he ever had any. His assertion that Alexander's army supposedly saw great shining silvery shields in the sky does not even remotely resemble any statement in any surviving ancient source about Alexander. This claim is probably completely made up. The ancient sources about Alexander's campaigns do mention silver shields, quote unquote, but not in the context of anything that could reasonably be construed as having anything to do with UFOs. Unfortunately, this is a common feature among much of Frank Edwards' work, which often includes many bizarre and spectacular cases that very often are given no sources and no way to independently verify them, Did any of this really happen or not? Another similar account from around the same time period was given by Italian UFO researchers Alberto Ferroglio, who gives an account that supposedly happened in 332 BC in the midst of Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre during his campaigns against the Persians. And this is what the account reads. The fortress would not yield. Its walls were 50 feet high and constructed so solidly that no siege engine was able to damage it. The Tyrians disposed of the greatest technicians and builders of war machines of the time, and they intercepted in the air the incendiary arrows and projectiles hurled by the catapults on the city, the catapults on the side of Alexander the Great. One day suddenly there appeared over the Macedonian camp these quote-unquote flying shields, as they had been called, which flew in triangular formation, led by an exceedingly large one. The others were smaller by almost a half. In all there were 5. The unknown chronicler narrates that they circled slowly over Tyre, while thousands of warriors on both sides stood and watched them in astonishment. Suddenly, from the largest shield, quote unquote, came a lightning flash that struck the walls. These crumbled, other flashes followed, and walls and towers dissolved, as if they had been built of mud, leaving the way open for the besiegers, who poured like an avalanche through the breaches. The flying shields, quote unquote, hovered over the city until it was completely stormed. Then they very swiftly disappeared aloft, soon melting into the blue sky. So once again, there are no known ancient sources for this account, leaving to us to wonder just how much veracity it has. Indeed, it has been suggested that Fenoglio may have based this purported account on the one in Edwards' book. Once again, McDaniel gives a scathing view of the case, and it says this: the only ancient passage that even vaguely resembles anything close to what Fenoglio describes occurs in Quintus Curtius Rufus's Histories of Alexander the Great. Curtius writes, indeed, the Tyrians were heated with much fire bronze shields, which, having been filled with heated sand and boiled dirt, they were suddenly hurled from the city walls, and no plague was feared more than this, for when the burning hot sand penetrated between the armor and the body, by no power could a man shake it out, and eventually it touched, it burned. And the soldiers, throwing away their weapons and tearing to pieces everything that could protect them, stood open to injuries, unable to retaliate, he said. I suppose that this passage does technically mention flying shields during the siege of Tyre, but the shields are actual, literal shields made out of the bronze, and they are only flying because the Tyrians are throwing them at Alexander's soldiers on the walls of the city. This passage is clearly talking about defense siege warfare, not UFOs in any sense. It's possible that Fenoglio may have read Edwards' claims about Alexander having seen great, shiny, silvery shields, quote unquote. He may have gone searching for a source, and he may have found some version of the passage from Curtius describing the Tyrians hurling shields during the siege of Tyre. Then it's possible that he may have badly misinterpreted the passage to make it about UFOs. I, however, suspect that it's more likely that Fenoglio never read any of Curtius's work. He made up the whole story about Alexander seeing flying shields during the siege of Tyre purely as an embellishment on Edward's earlier story, and his description just happened to bear a vague resemblance to something Curtius actually wrote, described. Despite the complete lack of any identifiable sources, the story of Alexander the Great and his UFOs has managed to work its way into the lore and will pop up from time to time in discussions on ancient UFO sightings. It's a shame that there is little to corroborate any of it, and it's likely a fabrication or very loose and twisted interpretation of historical events, but it is all a damn strange story all the same. And this is on Mysterious Universe by Brent Schweitzer. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box